when you've got a relationship with a supplier that's a critical component for your design, the last thing you want to do is be squeezing every penny out of them in order to save a few dollars down the road, because you need that relationship. If they go belly up, you go belly. That's why it's called collaborative consultants, because they believe in collaboration as the most powerful tool there is.
I'm Clayton Carpenter. I'm here with Dave Weiss, retired engineer and program manager. Today we're going to talk about supplier management, how you manage your suppliers, how you get your products to make, how you get the suppliers to make your products, how you go about all of that. So welcome, Dave.
Hey, thanks, Clayton.
Thanks for being here.
Thank you, I appreciate it. I appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks. So what is the supplier management situation?
Well, you know, just like in collaboration, you can't do everything alone. So you're always going to be buying something from someone to make your products. So it's really important to establish who the critical suppliers are that you're going to be partnering up with. There are a lot of different variations of that. But the key thing to start out with is really understanding the requirements that you have for your product. What are the key features of your design? Where are the critical elements of the supplier interfaces that you're going to have? So maybe like on an airplane, it might be the engine. Engine's a critical component. You're not going to build the engine yourself because you're an airplane manufacturer. You're going to let the engine supplier provide the engine. So that's going to be a critical supplier that you really want to make sure that you select correctly, and you create a partnership and establish a critical contractual relationship with that person that supports the overall success of the project or the program, and also each company independently. And that can be a fine line to walk down, because you want to make sure that you've got a win-win scenario for the negotiations, both the supplier benefits and also your company benefits as well from the relationship. So it's really important, first of all, look at your requirements, identify what are the critical aspects of your design. And from the top level, flow those requirements down and identify which of those requirements are going to impact suppliers that you have within your program.
So, sorry.
No, go ahead.
How do you go about managing the strategy that you do with your suppliers? Is it a competition with them in some senses? Is it always collaboration? Is it cooperation? Do you work hand in hand?
Yeah, it depends on the specific item that you're trying to procure. So in some cases, let's say you've got an engine and you're just buying a standard engine, or it could be Pratt & Whitney or GE engine, and you don't really care about which engine. They both meet certain performance criteria for you. You're totally ambivalent about which one you choose. You're probably never totally ambivalent, but in either case, if you can get the right price with the right relationship, you're willing to compete that between the two. So that would be an example of when you're trying to compete. On the other hand, you may have let's say it's an engine where the design of the engine is absolutely critical to the success of your airplane, as an example, or whatever the product is. And in that case, and it's only one supplier that can provide that specific engine. Now you've got a very different scenario where the requirements of that engine are absolutely essential to your product performing the way you want it to. So now you've got to say, well, I need a very, it's not a competitive situation anymore, it's a collaborative one, or a partnership possibly. So there are little different ways of approaching that problem with the supplier. You can say, I'm willing to collaborate with you, or I'm willing to partner with you. And so you want to select a strategy that supports both of you. So as an example with that, you may go to the supplier and say, what would incentivize you the most? Would you be willing to take a partnership relationship where you eat some of the upfront development costs, but you get a larger percentage of the production cost, so that you can make up that investment, if you will, from the development standpoint? Or you may say, if they're more incentivized to keep the cash flow coming, we'll collaborate with you, give you more of a upfront money during the design process, but we get a price break in the production side. So it could be a mutually agreeable thing that you do between the two of you, but it's one that benefits both of you for whatever your particular situation is. So it's very dependent upon the situation and the financial situation of each company and how you want to proceed as you move forward. But you need to be thinking of it as a win-win situation, not a win-lose. A lot of times when people go into negotiations, they try to make it, oh, I've got to win over the other one, and so I'm going to squeeze every ounce out of that supplier that I can. When you've got a relationship with a supplier that's a critical component for your design, the last thing you want to do is be squeezing every penny out of them in order to save a few dollars down the road, because you need that relationship. If they go belly up, you go belly up. So you want to make sure that they are sustainable and that they can survive and be maintained for the life of the program. They shouldn't, you don't want it to be squeezing every ounce of them and potentially put them at risk of losing the company. So it's really a strategic approach to it. On the other hand, you may be saying, oh, I've got a lot of bolts and nuts and stuff, I want to get the best price. It's a commodity item, I can buy them from anywhere. And in that case, you definitely go out and compete, and you say, where can I get the best price at the quickest cost and the highest quality? And you compete across dozens of vendors, and you don't really care. You can recompete it every single year and make sure that as long as you've documented what the quality requirements are and what the price is and schedule are clearly, and then compete appropriately and make sure that they perform against that. And so a lot depends just on the design of the part, on the design, how critical that design is within your overall product. So understanding your product, understanding the requirements and how they flow down, and then understanding the relationship that you have with those suppliers is all part of the strategy that you develop with those suppliers. So, and then there's other ones where maybe that particular part is specific to a company where they've developed their own intellectual property. That IP is solely owned by that one company. And if it's critical to the success of your design and meeting your performance requirements, that's another example where you'd want to have a very strategic relationship with. And the same thing goes like what I was talking about with the engine, where you want to establish a very strategic either partnership or create a contract that is that has some key words around it for protecting their intellectual property, at the same time protecting you as a company, that you'll be able to continue forward and have the product that you need for the duration of your product.
So in these meetings, there's business types, legal types for all these contracts. That's probably
Correct.
a big part of this section.
Yes,
So
there would be.
what type of contracts do you get into?
Well, there's a variety of them, and all of that depends on the risk and the contractual relationship that you want to have, and what type of contractor they are, and what type of relationship you want to have. So if you want to have a partnership relationship, as an example, you could have a much different contractual type. It could be a cost-plus contract, where you're willing to allow them to charge everything that they're spending, and plus they get a profit on top of it. It could be a fixed-price contract if they're willing to absorb all of the risk associated with the development of that design. Or they may say, I'll do cost-plus in the development, and I'll do fixed-priced in production, or vice versa. So a lot depends on the risk that they have as they move into the design process and the production process. And then it's an assessment between who's willing to bear the brunt of that risk and who's going to benefit from that risk. So typically when a person or company bears the brunt of the risk, they also get the benefit of the reward. So if you do a cost plus, you typically can charge a higher percentage profit margin as a result. And if you do cost plus, then you don't get as high of a profit margin as a result of that, because you're not absorbing the risk if you overrun. The other company, the company paying, is getting that. So you want to share the risk in many cases, and you can structure like a hybrid contract as an example, where you do some sort of cost sharing or performance sharing, where if you hit these milestones, you get paid extra dollars. And so a lot depends on what's really driving your requirements. Is it schedule? Is it performance requirements? What are the aspects that are critical to you as a program? And then structure your subcontracts with your key suppliers in the same way. What's really important is to make sure that your contractual arrangement lines up exactly with the requirements of how you're trying to execute your program and your strategy. If you're trying to be the first one to market and you don't care as much about the cost of the product, but it's very important that you're the first one to market, you now want to structure all of your subcontracts as schedule incentive contracts, so that they make sure that they are able to execute on schedule and on performance, and you're willing to maybe pay an extra premium for that. But you want to make sure that you're lining up with your strategy. If your strategy is first to market, then schedule is king. If your schedule is, I want to do it at the lowest possible price, I want to make sure that I reserve all of my investment dollars as much as possible, and I'm not as worried about hitting the schedule on time, okay, then you'll structure your contract a little differently. And it may be, instead of a cost plus, you may do it as a performance incentive contract, as an example, where they hit the various performances and they may get paid extra that way, or it may be a fixed price, where the supplier absorbs most of the risk. So again, it depends on an accurate risk assessment, an understanding of your requirements, and an understanding of your overall strategy, and make sure that all three of those line up when you're picking your supplier and you're partnering with them and establishing the contract that lines up with them.
Mm-hmm.
So you need all those elements that you described. You need the contracts, you need the legal, you need the engineering support, you need the program management, all of you working together to assess the risk, identify the strategy, and make sure that you're executing properly with the supplier.
So you've been on both sides of the coin. So you've bought products, like for instance the story of getting your rating up from red to gold.
Yeah,
You were the supplier in that sense, so you kind of see both sides of the coin.
I do.
So do most people have that insight? And how do you feel seeing both sides? Do you have a little more empathy for the suppliers in that situation because you know what it's like?
So it's kind of an interesting game you play. I think typically the suppliers will have an upper hand because they know more about their product than the ones purchasing it. So it's, if they don't, and I've had one instance where I was the program manager and I knew a lot about the design, and the contracts officer I was dealing with didn't understand the design very well. And he got very frustrated with me because in negotiations I was able to argue about how long things were taking, and I knew more about the product than he did. So I remember one time we were negotiating and he got very mad. He said, "It's not fair that you know more about this than I do." And so he got very frustrated. I got a good deal, fair deal, I thought. I negotiated what I thought was a fair incentive for them, fair profit margin for them. But I knew so much that he couldn't have any pad in his numbers at all. And so there was a fair amount of risk for them to be able to accomplish that. But it's really important to understand all of the requirements, understand the design thoroughly. When you're procuring with a supplier, you want to know as much about that product as you can, because that helps you level the playing field with that supplier. And on the supplier side, you really need to understand what the customer wants. What's their hot button? What is their strategy for execution? And try to align the contract and system with that. If you're really got the same objectives in mind, you're trying to accomplish the same things, you can create a win-win contract. It's when you have opposing priorities where it gets really, really difficult. If a contractor or subcontractor is trying to just milk the contract for as much money as they can, and the prime contractor is trying to get the best value for the buck, those can be opposing values, and it's really important to make sure that you're all aligned or get a win-win, and it's difficult to get that if you've got totally opposing priorities. So understanding that, going into the negotiations, understanding the other's priorities, really helps you get to a negotiation faster. A lot of times those agendas are hidden, and they're not going to want to disclose them to you. They're going to want to hide it, keep it hidden, say, oh, no, I don't want to tell you what my real agenda is. So I find it's beneficial to get to know the supplier, especially the critical ones that you have. Strike up a partnership with them and be open and honest and candid, and then share all of the information that you have. You don't want any hidden activities going on. You want to be open and honest at all times. You want to know everything that's happening at the moment that it happens, in both directions. And so that way you keep your channels open and you're communicating effectively, and you'll be able to deal with situations that are going to arise in an effective manner. But if you keep it hidden, like the example with the where we had the part that went bad on the quality rating you were talking about, if we had held that information in and waited to disclose it to our customer, it would have wound up being a very tragic story, and we would have been damaged by it, and the customer would have been damaged by it in the end. By being open and honest and disclosing it immediately, we were able to achieve that gold rating, even though we had a significant toxic problem to our part. So I'm a firm believer in being open and honest, especially when you've got a key relationship with a customer or with a supplier.
So what about the documentation process? If you come to me with a proposal and I bounce back and you bounce back, and it goes back and forth, are you documenting every process along the way so you can kind of see what I have at stake? Because my first offering might give you some insight, even if I change it later.
It might, and oftentimes it does change. What I find important is to make it very clear about what the business market is. What do you see the future for the company? And so I've been fairly successful in the past with being able to negotiate good contracts with suppliers when I'm totally open about what the total market is. If you go in and you say, well, I've got my next contract and it's going to be worth 100 units and I want to get the best price possible, can you help me offset some development costs? They're likely to say no. For 100 units, I'm not going to give a huge investment. But if I tell them the first set is 100 units, the next phase is going to be 5,000, and the next phase after that is going to be over $1 million, well, now I've got my interest, and they're going to be willing to negotiate a much more lucrative deal. And they might be willing to absorb some of the costs early for a bigger share of the profits in the end, especially when you've got economies of scale of in the millions of parts that you're trying to fabricate. So understanding the total picture and negotiating appropriately with the suppliers and making sure that they understand what their role could be can be helpful. And if they lock in, for example, you could say, if you promise to give us a significant amount of development cost, they might be able to say, I guarantee that you'll have the production side of it as well. We're not going to compete that. That could be very lucrative for them. So there's a lot of ways of skinning the cat, if you will, and documenting this all along the way, because sometimes people have short memories or people change. And it's very important to document the strategies, document the schedule, have the requirements nailed down. If you don't document the requirements clearly, they could deliver a part that's inferior. And they'll say, hey, the contract says, these requirements, or you were kind of loose on the requirements, so we still comply with the contract. And then you're stuck. So you want to be as crystal clear as possible, even if you think you're being overly specific. You never know what's going to come back and bite you. So the more details you can put in, the better. And pretty much any lawyer will tell you that. But you need to get really very specific with them as you document everything you can and put that in the contract as you move forward.
And how often are you reporting to your teams back and forth?
Well, that depends a little bit on the schedule that you have and the level of development or maturity of the design. I tend to like if the maturity of the design is somewhat stable, maybe weekly or monthly, and it depends on how much you're coordinating and how close you are to those end dates. But if the maturity is very stable and you're just buying a commodity, you may need just once a month or every quarter. It just depends on what the issue is that you're trying to coordinate with them on. If you're in a detailed design phase, weekly is probably mandatory.
So what about negotiations? What's the biggest impact of negotiations on, you've seen both sides, so.
Yeah, again, understanding the requirements, knowing the schedule, and understanding what's motivating each side. So when you come to the table in an open forum and willing to put all the cards on the table, and being able to build trust with the supplier, know that you're not out there to screw them over. You're there to really create a win-win scenario. And if they come to the table with a win-win, you can both work collaboratively together to get to that end state. And it doesn't have to be a confrontational approach. It can be actually a very collaborative approach to creating that document that you want. I like to work that way. So I like to put everything on the table and say, here's what I'm trying to do. So when you have those hidden agendas, that it becomes confrontational. And so I like to tear out those hidden agendas and make it non-confrontational, make it a collaborative approach. Because I think you get a better product in the end and create that win-win. When you have the hidden agendas, you tend to create a win-lose scenario. Someone's going to lose and someone's going to win in that scenario.
Awesome. Anything else on managing the suppliers?
There's such a critical part of executing the business that you can't understate the importance of supplier management. You need to do it early. You need to get a key supplier management in place early. Have them assigned to start creating and establishing critical suppliers up front before